Thank you for joining the Lakeside Light Podcast. It's light to help you see your way, and a light version of our full televised Sunday services, which you can find on our website at lakesidechurch.org. This audio podcast is a weekly sermon message of intellectual, spiritual, and sometimes humorous nourishment for the road. Enjoy.
Oh God, move in and around and between us. Breathe your spirit into this time, that the words spoken may be acceptable in your sight. O you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. When was the last time you saw a cross? Yeah, I know, it's a trick question. There's one right there. It's probably that one, right? Okay, all right. But besides that big cross, when was the last time you saw a cross? Think of the times over the past week you've seen a cross, right? Maybe in a photo, on roadsides, maybe on jewelry. Where do we see the cross? My friend Rachel likes to describe the Gospel of Mark as like a sandwich. You kind of have your outside bread, which holds together all of the delicious things on the inside of the sandwich. If anyone remembers from a few months ago the word chiastic, it's like a Petrushka doll. Anyway, it's like a sandwich. Mark is like a sandwich, and even though it's like a sandwich, I would say it's maybe more like a panini. It's a really quick, tight sandwich, Mark is. He's not super prosy, but either way, it's like a sandwich in that you cannot eat one ingredient at a time when it comes to the Gospel of Mark, right? In order for the sandwich to make sense, you got to eat the bread and all the inside ingredients at the same time. So, I'm going to remind you a bit about the bread that makes up Mark, especially the opening and closing pieces of bread that you get. The very first verse of the Gospel of Mark is this: the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Those are the words that open Mark's Gospel. And then in our earliest versions of Mark's Gospel, these are the closing words, the closing part of the sandwich. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So here is our Gospel of Mark sandwich. This is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. So our question today is, how is it that Mark is going to pull together the flavors of good news and fear and silence, of the Son of God and fear and hiding? Welcome to chapter 8 of the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 8, this passage is the center of the center of the center of things for the Gospel of Mark. It happens at the very center of the book and of the journey. Today's passage is the meat of the matter. For Mark, this passage is what it is all about. So the disciples are in Caesarea Philippi, a very Roman setting, full of empire and kingly competing gods. And Jesus has taken 7 chapters to teach, to call the disciples, to feed, to heal, to have miracle after miracle. And now we get to chapter 8, the center of things, and we have this crucial question: who do people say that I am? Jesus asks the disciples, they have some answers, and then he asks, "Who do you say that I am?" Who do you say that I am? And for the first time in the Gospel of Mark, we hear the word Messiah. Peter says, "You are the Messiah, the anointed one, the Christ, the one who has come to save God's people." Peter uses the word Messiah. And so here that is, right? This echoes those first words of Mark that you heard, the good news of the Messiah, the Son of God, the anointed one. But now, here we have the plot twist. Because at this point, Jesus reveals the kind of Messiah that he is. He tells the disciples, actually, he tells everyone. It is very open. He said it quite openly, Mark tells us, that he will undergo suffering, be rejected, and be killed. And then, in case you were thinking there was still an escape hatch, he doubles down, right, on this plot twist. He's making sure it is very clear. Asking him to be a different kind of Messiah is the opposite of what he wants. It is the opposite of what he needs. "Get behind me, Satan," he says to Peter, who refuses to accept this kind of lordship. And he tells us, if that's the kind of Messiah he's going to be, if that is the kind of Messiah you are going to follow, then that's the kind of person you are going to be too. "If any wish to come after me, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me." Take up your cross. The meat of Mark's sandwich can be kind of hard to swallow. The cross, this cross idea, it has a lot of layers, of course, right? And it is not as simple as just suffering. Taking up your cross cannot be boiled down to just enduring suffering. Pain and suffering in and of itself does not capture everything that Jesus is after here. After all, these are integral parts of being human. And moreover, the first 7 chapters of Mark have demonstrated over and over that Jesus has tremendous compassion for the kind of suffering we all relate to. He has just spent the first part of this gospel offering healing to those who are sick. He's bringing children back from their deathbeds at the behest of their mothers. He's feeding crowds with bread and fish, practical ameliorations, helping people who are suffering. But Jesus here says, deny yourselves and take up a cross, because Jesus is not just interested in the kind of messiahship Peter might have imagined. Jesus is interested here in power. What Jesus is talking about in this cross is he is talking about power. Jesus refers to the cross, and he knows exactly what his disciples and this crowd of people, these early followers and hearers of this story will imagine. He knows what they will see when he says the word cross. They will see a symbol of political execution. What they will imagine is a tool of torture and a public display of power over. The Seminole theologian James Cone likens the cross to the lynching tree. Right? Others have heard it likened to the electric chair. Right? Acknowledging Jesus as the Messiah, the symbol of power and might, the Son of God, acknowledging this must now be reconciled with a cross, the symbol of weakness, the symbol of foolishness. The world sees power as command of and dominance over, and Jesus is making us see power as service to and suffering with. And of course, serving and helping others feels good enough until you really follow that thread all the way down the path, because dismantling power over is ultimately life-threatening work. It might mean giving up comfort or familiarity, right? It might mean facing hard truths. It might mean ceding the floor. It might mean having to let your heart break. And in Jesus' case, it meant execution by cross. So this is the meat of Mark's sandwich: risking safety and security for the sake of others and facing the consequences. Suffering not for the sake of suffering, but suffering as a consequence of refusing to play by the world's rules of power. That's the cross. Which is why it makes complete sense that for some 2,000 years, we Christians have come up with all the ways we can think of to make the cross a little bit more palatable, right? Or the ways we have maybe made the sandwich an entirely different sandwich altogether. I was not able to be at Will Umphres' class this morning, but I heard him say that he was going to talk about Emperor Constantine the Great. Constantine used the symbol of the cross incredibly powerfully, right? And it was because he had been advised by someone that had a vision that he was to use the cross as a sign of conquering. So he slapped onto banners and shields and swords, in hoc signo vences, right? By this sign, the cross, thou shalt conquer. The story is that even when he first heard about this idea, he wasn't sure what to do until he was in a dream. He saw Jesus in that dream, and it was revealed to him that he was to use the sign against his enemies, use the cross to dominate those he wanted to dominate. Talk about get behind me, Satan. Right? That's the wrong sandwich. And here we are, right? It's fall of 2024. Now is the season of power pursuit. It's always the season of power pursuit. So how often in our current culture and time do we see a co-opting of the cross for power, for political power, for militaristic power? And how often do we ourselves fall prey to the temptation to think of the cross as a means to an end, a means to ease or comfort or stability? In what ways have we sugar-coated the cross? Or made it so familiar to us that it no longer tastes like anything at all? So that it no longer tastes just strange enough? Last week in reading the gospel or the epistle of James, I reminded us that if God is love, don't be a jerk. If God is love, don't be a jerk. This week it might be fair to say, if Jesus is Messiah, take a risk. If Jesus is Messiah, take a risk. Losing our lives means more than suffering. Following Jesus means taking up the side of the oppressed. It means preferring the well-being of others over the comfort of ourselves. It means risking predictability and safety and all the trappings of control. Now, the Gospel of Mark, it begins the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. It begins this way, and then there's this meat of this story. Jesus asks, "Who do you say that I am?" And then Jesus tells us to take what we thought of as good news, all that good Son of God stuff, and to turn it on its head. And then for the following 8 chapters, it will make more and more sense that the other end of the gospel reads, "And they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." Jesus makes it clear to Peter and those within earshot, you cannot get the bread of life without tasting the heart of the matter. But friends, Mark's gospel itself may be a well-composed panini, but God's big story might be more of what we're living in now, more of an open-faced sandwich. God's story is still wide open. Mark ends his gospel with fear and silence. He's emphasizing the challenge. He wants nothing sugar-coated or easily resolved, but even Mark knows the story's not over. Mark, after all, tells the story. He becomes part of the story. He adds the chapter of someone writing and sharing the gospel itself. Even Mark knows the story's not over, even if the sandwich is complete for his gospel. Our story as disciples is not over. Our story as people of God is not over, and our story as church is not over. The power of the cross was never meant to be the power of worldly political gain. And nor was it simply about sacrificial suffering. In the cross, when it is given the potency it deserves, we can see power as it was truly meant to be. Not a power that ignores or negates our pain, but one that sees the reality of our pain that we are living and joins it, and then turns the whole story on its head. That story is still being told, and that is the story we embrace with this empty cross. If we let it, the empty cross at the center of the sanctuary can remain a powerful symbol. But we have to remind ourselves and our world that what the cross stands for is different than the kind of power we see in our world now. And what the cross stands for is what makes it beautiful. Joseph says to his brothers, "What you meant for evil, God used for good." Paul tells us the cross is foolishness for those who are perishing, but to those of us who are being saved, it is the power of God. I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. This empty cross, when we see it for what it really is, and when we reclaim it, is the kind of cross that even taking up for ourselves can in fact lead to new life and hope. May it be so.
The Lakeside Light Podcast is a copyrighted production of Lakeside Presbyterian Church. Visit our website at lakesidechurch.org for more information. Have a great week.